I'm Afshin Rattansi, and we're going underground as today a Saudi crown prince, hot on the heels of meeting the Queen, journeys to Trump's White House. Coming up on the show, corruption at the highest levels of government. 10 years to the day the UK Financial Services Authority launched an investigation into the City of London over share manipulation. We speak to legendary British broadcaster Noel Edmonds about his David versus Goliath battle against banking and neoliberal governance. And Die Hard 2 McMafia. Why are the Russians always portrayed as the bad guys? We speak to the author of National Security Cinema about US military intelligence agencies influencing nearly 1,800 movies and TV shows. Plus, was the whole anti-Semitism scandal in the UK Labour Party just a bad McCarthyite film from the 1950s? One of the targets, former Vice Chair of Momentum Jackie Walker, performs a scene from her play The Lynching, taking us back a generation to her own mother's fight for free speech. All this and more coming up in today's Going Underground. But first, as all UK parties vow to get to grips with corrupt Moscow money flooding into London, and as Vladimir Putin looks set to be elected again, in part because of his reputation for attacking IMF World Bank-created oligarch gangsters, there is a financial anniversary today. 10 years ago today, the UK's Financial Services Authority launched an unprecedented investigation into dealings in the shares of major financial companies in the City of London. Well, someone who is directly affected by the claims of corruption is the former host of UK television's Swap Shop and Deal or No Deal broadcasting legend, Noel Edmonds. Noel, welcome back to Going Underground. In the studio at last. There's an ongoing police investigation about one of our great banks, HBOS. You're involved in a big case with them. I've got to ask, right at the beginning, how is it that you didn't think that there was something odd about your finances way back when, and it was only when your old bank manager was jailed that you suspected that you had been the victim of fraud?
When you put it like that, I am a bit of an idiot, aren't I? But the reality is that even in the early 2000s, prior to the crash, we still respected bankers and we trusted bankers.
Are you sure?
Yeah, I think we did. And in 2003-04, when my businesses started to suffer issues with their relationship with HBOS, I still thought that
it's all your fault.
Yeah. And even after the collapse of the businesses, when they were forced into administration in 2007, I put it down to one of those things in life that actually I had been a rubbish businessman. And so, yeah, however naive as it sounds, when almost a year ago, 5 people went to prison for 47 years for this crime, it was a light bulb moment. That was the clang. Hang on a minute, Mark Dobson, he was my bank manager.
But this is a bank that before all of this had allegations of money laundering, had to settle with the US regulators for $350 million, accused by HMRC of aggressive tax avoidance. How many other business people were out there who were blaming themselves and not even understanding that there was money leaking away?
Okay, well, I can see the frown and I see your point, and I'm dangerously close to protecting Lloyds Banking Group here, which is not really what I feel very comfortable with. But what you've got to remember is that we were trusting our professionals. I mean, I've really got into this, and I now think that it was probably around about the Thatcher years that something quite fundamental happened in the UK. We used to have professions and we used to have industry. And suddenly we industrialised our professions. And that is a green light for corruption. So we had lawyers who had products. We had the local solicitor who had products. Suddenly we had banks who talked about products. It became industrialised. And we've even got now education that's got products. And this was an open door for corrupt people. And I will say, because it's really important, not all bankers are corrupt. I mean, Lloyds Banking Group has, 70,000 employees. They're not all bad people. But what you would be surprised when you delve into the facts is how small is the number of bankers in the UK that have caused 10 years of austerity for Britain and are still conducting themselves in a way that was recently described in the House of Commons as potentially criminal.
They deny any accusations of corruption and say they tried to reach a consensual resolution with you. and they can't talk because of ongoing litigation. But then, instead of democratic control coming to the rescue, would you say that, and because the taxpayer then ended up bailing out all of these banks, it's had to be the law and legal companies and class action lawsuits? Tell me about this white horse and this knight in shining armor, Ethereum, currently involved with Volkswagen diesel emission scandals. They're coming to help you.
Well, yes. I mean, I don't think people in the UK realise that Lloyd's annual bill for lawyers, both in-house and external, is over £1 billion. Now, when you look at their profits, when you look at their turnover, when you look at their assets, that is a totally disproportionate amount of money to be spending with lawyers, and it says a lot about the way they conduct themselves. They know they're going to get sued by the regulators, they know they're going to get fined, and they factor it into the balance sheet.
And those are bigger budgets than the legal opinions sought by the regulators, the statutory regulators.
Well, don't get me going on. We don't have a regulator in this country. It's called the FCA, and the wonderful Andrew Bailey, who hopefully now has scuppered his chances of taking over from Carney. But, you know, the FCA is toothless. They're frightened of RBS, they're frightened of Lloyd's. They've even said publicly we can't afford a legal action with these banks. So that's something that's got to be looked at. But you mentioned Ethereum. So Ethereum are a major global fund. They looked at my case and they decided on merit. They said, look, we know you're high profile in the UK, you're a famous person or whatever. We are nervous you might want your day in court, have a big Perry Mason moment. And I said, no, I don't. I would still like to negotiate a settlement with Lloyd's. They looked at the merits and they said, we'll fund it. So for many millions of pounds, I don't have to worry, and the case is even insured. So in the, I think, unlikely event that a judge found in Lloyd's favour, I still cannot lose a penny. And that is a serious game shifter.
I mean, as I said, Lloyd's Banking Group deny all these allegations. We don't want them to sue us. You're not afraid they're going to sue you? I understand that you mock Lloyd's Banking Group regularly on your radio stations in between ABBA and Destiny's Child.
I have a radio station, one of 23 radio stations that I have, which can be heard around the world under the Positivity brand, Positivity Radio World. I dedicated my station, Positively Noel, that used to have light-hearted stuff, to basically telling the truth about Lloyd's. And yes, you're right. I think every 2 weeks my lawyers get threats of defamation, etc., etc.
Ongoing?
Oh, yeah, bring it on. Oh, I have 2 whistleblower sites, and Herbert Smith something, their expensive lawyers, said that I was breaking the law not providing Lloyd's with the information that the whistleblowers were providing. I mean, you've got to laugh at the arrogance of these people. The whole point of encouraging whistleblowers is the truth gets out there. And there's Lloyd's wanting me to say, oh, by the way, Fred Bloggs in your Edinburgh office alleges this. Am I going to do that? Of course not. It's the whistleblowers that can change everything in this country. In
defence of the regulators, they'd say they don't have as many resources. There has been some criticism. I remember Paul Moore, a whistleblower, who was on this show maybe 3 years ago, who was making allegations about auditors, that regulators need the same auditors as the companies because they know more about the situation because they've worked in those companies. What do you make of that argument? You've got the 4 big companies, the 4 big auditor companies, and every single time one of these banks says, we'll have an independent review, they use their auditor. There is no independence. So the independent Griggs review that Lloyd's brought in to look at the victims' claims isn't independent. They hired Griggs. They pay Griggs, they tell Griggs how much money they think they can get away with, and Griggs get a rubber stamp out. There's nothing independent about it. I mean, it goes back to Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling. I mean, the people that introduced the laissez-faire attitude, the light touch regulation. In all of this, in the destruction of hundreds of thousands of SMEs in the UK, apparently no one has done anything wrong. Lloyd's has set up this £100 million fund to compensate. Good Freudian slip. Fine. There's no fine yet. And Lloyd's Banking Group is saying good progress is being made with apportioning out this £100 million for I presume these are settlements and not admissions of liability or negligence on their part.
What they say to the victims is, we will give you money for distress and what you suffered at the time, because it must have been horrible for you. They are terrified of admitting guilt about it. And certainly, having broken so many businesses, they're not about to give people their stolen goods back. So you won't get an admission of any guilt. I mean, at mediation, they said to me, your businesses would have failed anyway, and we don't believe you're a victim of a crime. Well, fortunately for me, Thames Valley Police don't agree. And my case is now the subject of a criminal investigation. So I'm limited as to what I can say about that. But I can assure you that having spent £7 million pursuing the original crime under Operation Hornet, Thames Valley Police would not be spending more public money if they didn't believe they were going to get important prosecutions.
Well, the police is investigating, as you say. Let's just go to you being a broadcaster, how the media has informed the British public about the ongoing crisis that began in 2008. Because some would say, we've been told that this is a vital part of the British economy and we have to at all costs sacrifice everything from libraries, public libraries, to social services to save it, because without that, Britain's prosperity is threatened. How would you characterize the media reporting of what the banks did to the country?
I only know what I see, and that is that millions of people in this country have suffered austerity, and it isn't because of subprime markets in the States, it isn't because of Lehman Brothers, it isn't because of this great global thing. It's actually because a few bankers in the UK got very greedy. They introduced strategy to try and boost their balance sheets by stripping the assets out of small to medium-sized businesses. What you have to remember is this goes back to the mid-1990s, when the banks suddenly became large with mergers with building societies, etc. And they actually became large and unprofitable. And they had to boost the balance sheet. So where did they go? You can't go to the consumer because that is so tightly regulated. So they went to the small to medium-sized businesses. And contrary to the way it has been reported, these weren't failing businesses, as we know from the GRG, the RBS division. Over 90% of those businesses were destroyed. They weren't all ailing businesses. It was an abattoir, it wasn't a hospital, GRG. The same with Lloyd's, BSU. These businesses had assets, and the bankers needed the assets. And so this was a wholesale culling of British businesses that were the backbone of our economy. And you use the term prosperity. I don't think this country is prosperous. And one of the reasons why we have deep economic problems is because we are so dependent upon the multinationals, the great big businesses that don't pay their taxes here anyway. And we tore out the backbone of the British economy, which was the small to medium-sized businesses.
Well, Omens, thank you. After the break, National Security Cinema, we speak to the star of The Writer with No Hands, a film documenting alleged US government collusion with Hollywood. All this and more coming up in part 2 of Going Underground. Welcome back. In a time when some journalists parrot security service spokespeople, Google plans to censor so-called fake news, and the leader of the free world fires people on social media. You could think that you could sit in front of the TV and switch on a film to get away from government-controlled output. But you'd be wrong. According to research done by our next guest, the US government has had close involvement in nearly 2,000 movies and TV shows. Dr. Matthew Alford, co-author of National Security Cinema, the shocking new evidence of government control in Hollywood, and the star of the film The Writer with No Hands, joins me now from Bath in the southwest of England. Matt, welcome to Going Underground. We appear to be in the middle of some kind of conspiracy film here in Britain with a few facts. How would you see the coverage of the tragedy in Wiltshire through the lens of, or the prism of, say, Noam Chomsky's idea about media manipulation and the manufacture of consent?
Well, Russia seems to be, and has been for 100 years, kind of official enemy. That's what the way that Chomsky would put it in the propaganda model. And official enemies are generally presented in more salacious ways than allies, regardless of what actions they are undertaking. It seems that this is just an extension of that. It always shocks me, really, that and I know this is a silly thing in a way to say on a Russian state TV show because it's kind of so obvious. But I mean, the last sort of 25 years, the Cold War's over. This should all have been put to bed a long time ago. Russia's got an economy the size of Italy. There is no threat from this country except for the way that, except for certain more minor actions, and it's kind of crazy that this is always being blown up into the biggest next thing when we have no evidence to point to Russian state involvement at this point, anyway.
What I want to know is your investigations and research suggests and emphasizes that we shouldn't be looking just at the way news may have preconceived notions about, say, Russia. You've done a lot of research on how Hollywood changes our perceptions.
Yeah, Hollywood's really important in terms of shaping the way that we see the outside world from the West. So, and that's what most of my work's been about for the past sort of 15 years, looking at how Hollywood, film industry, and TV as well, and video games shape the way that we see the outside world, shape the way that we see the institutions that govern us.
Well, some people might be shocked. Well, some people might be shocked at that connection. In recent days, the Pentagon has actually tweeted how proud it is to work with Ellen, Conan, The Price is Right, NCIS, Y50, Oprah. I know you've also investigated this. It's pretty much out in the open, though.
Well, they like to give the impression of openness. The Pentagon and CIA and White House have all worked with Hollywood producers for over 100 years. They want to show that they have good relationships so that they seem sort of normal and nice and all this kind of thing. But they also want to ensure that they're playing down the amount of cooperation that goes on between these entities, Hollywood and the government. And they also want to downplay how politicized that cooperation is. And of course, the relationship is very politicized, and it is very much more involved than anyone actually admits. I'll give you the key statistic on this, which is that until myself and Tom Secker did this research, the assumption and the current knowledge amongst academics and journalists was that perhaps a few hundred films and TV shows had been affected in some way by the Pentagon or CIA over the past century. But we've shown that it's several times more than that. It's actually several thousand products that have been affected. And some of these are affected in very political ways, including things that you perhaps wouldn't expect, like Meet the Parents and Iron Man and Hulk.
But of course, the Pentagon and the CIA would be quick to say all they are doing is correcting Hollywood productions, their scriptwriters, their directors, their actors, who knows, so that they get their perceptions of the U.S. military-industrial complex correct and don't make any mistakes.
Yeah, well, obviously there is some of that. It's a nice sort of cover story, and that is part of what's going on. But I'd say it's a very marginal part. I mean, in the end, yes, of course, the Pentagon's thinking, they're sort of telling themselves, I'm sure, oh, yes, we want to make sure that these medals are on this actor in the correct way, and we want to make sure that their hats aren't on the wrong way around. In practice, of course, they know that the agenda has to be much more political than that. They want to make sure that there is nothing that is confrontational information or dangerous information that is put out there that will make them look bad. Of course, that's what happens. Of course, any institution would do that.
Well, so, they also...
Would you ask McDonald's to give you to work on a film about cows? And expect that McDonald's would not try and manipulate the content of that production. But you don't need McDonald's to be the expert on cows.
But of course, they'd say also they wouldn't want any of these war films, particularly, perhaps more than say Ellen and chat shows, not to endanger the lives of U.S. servicemen and servicewomen.
Well, I don't know if they actually go quite as far as that with their argument, because that would be really crazy. I mean, films are not national security products. They are not something that is going to affect on what's happening on the ground. The news might be if you report the location of a particular military personnel, then of course that may endanger people. But films are made, 2 years after the events actually happened in the real world, or even decades after. Even the Pentagon does not defend themselves along those kind of lines. Oh, we're trying to protect national security. They protect it on PR lines and on the fact that they say, well, this is for the sake of accuracy. But that's obviously bogus.
Oh, given all your research, then, any viewers of this show, what should they be aware of when they see a product, as you're calling them, an entertainment product released from the United States of America, from a country which, as I say, the Pentagon admits clearly they do want to alter the perceptions of the US military using entertainment?
Well, I mean, just be aware that it happens very frequently, that perhaps if you were watching a film with the military that's actually depicted in it, there's probably about a 50% chance that that the script will have been gone through with a fine-tooth comb by the Pentagon and or CIA. If you think that sounds okay, then you're not going to be listening to what I say anyway. If you think that sounds like a dangerous thing for a government to have that kind of power, that kind of involvement, particularly behind closed doors, without a great deal of accountability. It's been very, very hard for us to acquire a lot of this information through Freedom of Information Act. It takes a long time. If you think that kind of closed way of approaching governance is a problem, then you're kind of with me.
So we should stick to British film, because that's fair and square, not allied to our military-industrial complex, hopefully.
Well, Britain doesn't have a great deal of a military complex, and the United States has a much more developed PR wing of its national security apparatus. But of course, any national cinema is the same, whether that's Russia or Britain or South Africa or whatever. Everyone has their national cinemas, and they all are operating for the good of those institutions when there is advice come in. The Americans do it so much more, though. It does happen a little bit with MI5. And a little bit with Israel and things like that, but our film industries are puny compared to Hollywood. So
you found no proof about the MI6 building blowing up in central London that was in the famous James Bond film. MI6 were nothing to do with the James Bond films.
There's been a bit of involvement from Mossad and MI5 in terms of supporting the Bond films. Yeah, we detail some of that in the book.
This is a new book.
But it's not as extensive. I mean, the main thing about what the Pentagon does is that it does it so kind of formally and officially. I'm about to go to an archive of material in Washington, D.C., where there are thousands of papers of scripts where where the Pentagon has written, change this, we want this amended, cross this out. That's what is so sort of structurally and done in such a kind of careful way by the American government. That doesn't seem to happen very much on with these other countries. There is obviously influence. The monarchy will be all over anything that's to do with the monarchy. But they won't have the kind of level of interference. It's just not possible on across the board as it is with the Pentagon.
Dr. Matthew Alford, thank you. Well, in a second, we'll hear from the former Vice Chair of the British Momentum Movement, Jackie Walker, perform a scene from her play, The Lynching, described as a fight for free speech, arguably more relevant today than ever. That's it for the show. We'll be back on Wednesday on the 12th anniversary of the launch of Twitter, de facto the new battleground for free speech. Till then, keep in touch via social media. We'll see you on Wednesday.
My name is Dorothy Rebecca Ferguson Walker. I was born in Spanish Town, Jamaica in 1915. I did well in school, very well in school. In fact, I won a scholarship to become a doctor at the world famous University for Colored People, Howard, in Washington, D.C. I had a great time at Howard. I have never seen so many well-educated people like me, colored people, all in one place. And we look good too. Some of them fellas. First time I realized about politics in America, I was walking down a hall at college and I hear it first, like a whisper. When Israel was in Egypt's land, let my people go. And I look through the door and I listen and I listen, and the voices are all around me. You see, this was just after the war, and politics was a dangerous game. They were telling us that the enemy was the Soviet Union and communism. There was a witch hunt led by Senator McCarthy. You hear of him? Yes. People who stepped out of line, people who wanted to change things, they were accused of being commies, of being un-American. They were smeared. They lost their reputations, their jobs. Some even lost their lives. So I became, what you call it now, political activist. But if it was a dangerous time to be an activist, can you imagine how it was to be a colored political activist? There was legalized segregation, you see. America was, in fact, at least in the South, what I would call an apartheid state. And the people then, no different to the people now, those people never want change. You resist, you are a threat. So the government responded same way it always does, with terror, state terror, a sort of legalized murder.